What if I told you that in the scorching red deserts of Central Australia, beneath an array of mysterious white radomes that locals called the golf balls, a quiet team of underestimated cryptographers uncovered a Soviet plan to annihilate 50 strategic targets across the Pacific, including Sydney, Melbourne, and American bases from Guam to Hawaii, and that their discovery, kept secret for decades, quietly prevented what could have been the spark for World War III? Before we dive deep into this incredible true story of courage, brilliance, and the most unlikely heroes of the Cold War, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Are you in Australia, the United States, or somewhere else in the world that might have been on that chilling list of targets? This is not just another Cold War espionage tale. This is the story of how a handful of brilliant minds, working in complete isolation in one of the most secretive facilities ever built, armed with nothing but pencils, paper, primitive computers, and relentless determination, achieved what the entire American intelligence apparatus believed was impossible. It's a story about how prejudice and arrogance nearly cost millions of lives, and how humility, patience, and an unshakable belief in one's own abilities can literally change the course of history. The events I'm about to share with you remained classified for over 40 years, hidden in the deepest vaults of Australian and American intelligence agencies, because what happened at Pine Gap in 1967 was so extraordinary, so paradigm-shifting, that acknowledging it would have forced the world's superpowers to completely reconsider who holds real power in the intelligence game. Picture this. The Australian outback, 1967, 18 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs. The landscape is biblical, endless red sand, skeletal ghost gums, heat that shimmers and distorts reality itself. Rising from this ancient, sacred Aboriginal land like something from a science fiction fever dream stands Pine Gap, officially known as the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap. To the outside world, it's a mysterious joint Australian-American research facility. To those in the know, it's the most sophisticated signals intelligence collection and analysis station in the Southern Hemisphere. A technological cathedral of espionage where the United States and Australia intercept, decode, and analyze communications from across the entire Pacific region. From Soviet naval vessels to Chinese military installations, from Indonesian political chatter to intercepted satellite transmissions bouncing through the ionosphere. The year 1967 sits at the absolute fever pitch of Cold War paranoia. The world has barely survived the Cuban Missile Crisis 5 years earlier. Vietnam is spiraling into chaos. The nuclear arms race has both superpowers stockpiling enough weapons to extinguish human civilization multiple times over. And in this pressure cooker of geopolitical tension, Pine Gap represents Australia's entry ticket into the exclusive club of global intelligence powers, a partnership with the Americans that promises protection, technology, and relevance on the world stage. But there's a problem, a tension that crackles through the facility's climate-controlled corridors like static electricity. The American intelligence officers and cryptographers stationed at Pine Gap view their Australian counterparts with barely concealed condescension. To them, Australia is the junior partner, the eager student, useful for providing land and logistics, but not quite sophisticated enough for the real intellectual heavy lifting of code-breaking and intelligence analysis. The Americans handle the important work. The Australians are there to support, to learn, to observe. This isn't official policy, of course, but it's the unspoken reality that permeates every briefing, every joint analysis session, every decision about who gets access to what intelligence. Enter Dr. Margaret Chen, though everyone calls her Maggie. 34 years old, born in Darwin to Chinese immigrant parents who fled the chaos of post-war China, Maggie is a mathematical prodigy who earned her doctorate in cryptography from the University of Melbourne at age 26. She's slight of build, barely 5'3", with thick-rimmed glasses that she constantly pushes up her nose, a habit born from countless hours hunched over codebooks and cipher tables. She dresses practically simple blouses, knee-length skirts, sensible shoes, and speaks in a soft, measured voice that forces people to lean in to hear her. There's nothing flashy about Maggie Chen, nothing that screams genius or hero to the casual observer. She's exactly the kind of person people overlook in a room full of tall, confident, loud American intelligence officers with their military bearing and Ivy League pedigrees. But Maggie possesses something extraordinary, a gift that even she doesn't fully advertise because she's learned that humility opens more doors than boasting. Her grandmother, who helped raise her in Darwin, was a Russian language teacher who had defected from the Soviet Union in the 1930s, fleeing Stalin's purges. Growing up, Maggie absorbed Russian language and culture at her grandmother's knee, learning not just the language but the patterns of Russian thought, the cultural references, the idioms and phrases that shape Soviet communication. She understands Russian The way a native speaker does, with an instinctive feel for nuance and context that can't be taught in a classroom. Combined with her mathematical brilliance and her obsessive attention to detail, this makes her uniquely qualified for exactly the kind of challenge that's about to land on Pine Gap's doorstep. October 15, 1967. The morning briefing in Pine Gap's main analysis chamber, a cavernous room filled with primitive mainframe computers, rows of desks covered in printouts and cipher wheels, and walls plastered with maps of the Pacific region marked with Soviet naval positions and suspected communication nodes. The air conditioning hums constantly, fighting against the brutal outback heat. Maggie sits in the back row with her small team of 3 other Australian cryptographers, all of them young, all of them brilliant, all of them accustomed to being given the less critical intercepts to analyze while the Americans handle the real work. Colonel James Bradford strides to the front of the room. He's everything Maggie isn't. 6'2", barrel-chested, with a voice that could command artillery battalions and a Distinguished Service Cross from Korea. He's been the senior American liaison at Pine Gap for 18 months, and he's made it abundantly clear that he considers this posting a career dead end, a babysitting job in the middle of nowhere. His attitude toward the Australian team ranges from patronizing politeness to outright dismissal. "Listen up," Bradford announces, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. "Last night, our satellite array intercepted a series of encrypted transmissions from a Soviet naval vessel operating in the Coral Sea. The encryption is unlike anything we've seen before. It's not standard Soviet naval cipher, not Red Army tactical, not KGB diplomatic protocol. Initial analysis suggests it might be a new GRU system, possibly for special operations or strategic weapons coordination. The crypto boys at NSA have been trying to crack it for the past 6 hours with no luck. They're calling it Pacific Dark, and right now it's living up to that name." He projects a slide showing pages of encrypted text, seemingly random strings of Cyrillic characters interspersed with numbers, following no discernible pattern. To most people in the room, it looks like complete gibberish. "CIA wants this decoded yesterday. We've got our top team on it, but I wanted you all aware in case we need to throw more resources at it." "Questions?" Maggie's hand rises slowly from the back. Bradford's eyes flick toward her with barely masked impatience. "Yes, Dr. Chen." "Colonel, may I see the full intercept transcript? Not just the sample slide, but the complete transmission sequence?" Her voice is quiet but clear. Bradford's jaw tightens. "Dr. Chen, with respect, our primary cryptographic team is already working on this. I don't think... I understand, Colonel. I'd simply like to review the patterns. Sometimes afresh. Perspective helps." There's no challenge in her tone, no assertion of superiority. Just a simple, humble request. Bradford exchanges a glance with his deputy, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The unspoken message is clear. Let the eager Australian play with the impossible puzzle if it keeps her busy. "Fine. We'll have copies sent to the auxiliary analysis room. But Dr. Chen, don't waste too much time on this. We have routine intercepts that actually need processing." The dismissal stings, but Maggie simply nods her thanks. As the briefing disperses, she catches the sympathetic looks from her Australian colleagues and the barely suppressed eye rolls from some of the American cryptographers. She's used to this. Being underestimated is something she's experienced her entire life. As a woman in a male-dominated field, as an Australian in an American-dominated facility, as someone of Chinese descent in an era still suspicious of anyone who doesn't fit a narrow definition of Western identity. What no one in that room understands is that Maggie Chen has spent her entire career preparing for exactly this moment. For the next 72 hours, Maggie and her small team work in near isolation in the auxiliary analysis room, really just a converted storage space with 4 desks, a single computer terminal, and a coffee pot that's never empty. They spread the intercept transcripts across every available surface, filling blackboards with frequency analyses, pattern matrices, and linguistic theories. The encrypted messages are maddeningly complex, clearly designed to resist exactly the kind of sophisticated cryptanalysis that NSA specializes in. But Maggie notices something the Americans have missed. Buried in the seemingly random character strings are tiny anomalies, statistical variations that shouldn't exist in a truly random cipher. It's like finding a whisper in a hurricane, a barely perceptible pattern that suggests the encryption isn't quite as impenetrable as it appears. More importantly, some of the character combinations trigger something in her memory, echoes of archaic Russian phrases her grandmother used, pre-Soviet linguistic constructions that hint at the cipher's underlying architecture. They're using a modified one-time pad, she tells her team on the 3rd night, her eyes red from exhaustion, her desk littered with coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches. But it's not purely mathematical. There's a linguistic component. They're embedding semantic layers that assume the decoder knows Russian cultural references from before 1917. That's why NSA can't crack it. They're approaching it as pure mathematics, but it's actually a hybrid system that requires cultural linguistic intuition. Her deputy, a young cryptographer named David Walsh, looks up from his calculations. That's brilliant, Maggie. But even if you're right, we'd need to identify the seed key for the one-time pad. And that could be anything. Not anything, Maggie interrupts, her voice suddenly energized. Look at the transmission timestamps. They align with significant dates in Russian history. The October Revolution, the Battle of Stalingrad. I think the seed keys are historically derived. If I'm right, we can start building a decryption matrix. It's a long shot, a theory built on intuition and deep cultural knowledge rather than hard mathematical proof. But it's all they have. By day 7, something extraordinary happens. As 3:47 a.m., Maggie's exhausted team achieves their first breakthrough. A single decoded sentence that emerges from the chaos of encrypted text like a face materializing from fog. Primary Pacific targets confirmed for strategic deterrence scenario. The words hang in the air of that cramped room like a death sentence. This isn't routine naval communication. This is something infinitely more dangerous. Maggie immediately requests an emergency meeting with Colonel Bradford. He arrives at 6 a.m., irritated at being pulled from breakfast, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. Standing in the auxiliary room, surrounded by Maggie's walls of calculations, he crosses his arms defensively. Dr. Chen, I hope this is worth interrupting. We've partially cracked Pacific Dark, Maggie says simply, handing him the decoded fragment. And Colonel, I believe we're looking at a Soviet nuclear targeting plan. The silence that follows is profound. Bradford's face cycles through disbelief, skepticism, and finally something resembling concern. That's a significant claim, Dr. Chen. Based on one sentence? Based on 7 days of pattern analysis, linguistic deconstruction, and cryptographic architecture that finally makes sense, Maggie responds, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. But we need more resources. Access to the main computer array, expanded satellite intercept data. And we need it now, because if I'm right about the cipher structure, we can decode the entire target list within 72 hours. Bradford's skepticism returns in full force. Dr. Chen, with all due respect to your enthusiasm, NSA has the best cryptographers in the world working on this. If they haven't cracked it, I find it highly unlikely that... He stops himself, but the implication hangs in the air. That a small team of Australian cryptographers has somehow succeeded where America's elite intelligence apparatus has failed. Colonel, Maggie says, and there's steel beneath the quiet voice. Now, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to let me prove it. Give me 72 hours with proper resources. If I'm wrong, you can reassign my entire team to filing intercepts for the rest of our posting. But if I'm right, she pauses, letting the weight of that possibility settle. If I'm right, we're looking at intelligence that could prevent catastrophic loss of life. The tension in that cramped room is suffocating. Bradford looks at the blackboards covered in Maggie's calculations, at her exhausted team, at the decoded fragment in his hand. He's facing a choice between institutional prejudice and the terrifying possibility that this unassuming Australian woman might actually be onto something extraordinary. 48 hours, he finally says. You get 48 hours and limited access to computing room B. But Dr. Chen, if this turns out to be a wild goose chase, there will be consequences for wasting facility resources. It's not trust, it's barely tolerance. But it's enough. What follows is the most intense 48 hours in Pine Gap's history. Maggie's team, now with access to better computing power, works in rotating shifts, feeding their decryption matrices into the primitive mainframes, cross-referencing historical Russian dates and cultural references, building a skeleton key to unlock Soviet secrets. Bradford assigns a skeptical American cryptographer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, to observe and verify their work, essentially to watch for errors, or more likely to document their failure. But as the hours tick by, Lieutenant Webb's skepticism begins to crack. He watches Maggie work with an intensity and precision that's almost frightening, seeing her make intuitive leaps that somehow prove mathematically sound, witnessing her team's seamless collaboration. By hour 36, Webb is no longer observing. He's actively helping, drawn into the hunt despite himself. At hour 43, the dam breaks. The decryption matrix suddenly coheres and decoded text begins flowing from the mainframe printer in long, continuous sheets. Maggie grabs the printouts with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the Russian text, and the color drains from her face. "Oh my God," she whispers. "David, Get Colonel Bradford. Get him now. 15 minutes later, Bradford bursts into computing room B with his entire command staff, Webb having breathlessly explained that they have something big. What Maggie hands him is a complete translated document, 27 pages of Soviet military planning that reads like a blueprint for Armageddon. The document details 50 specific targets across the Pacific region designated for nuclear strikes in the event of escalated conflict. Australian cities including Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Darwin. American bases at Guam, Okinawa, and Pearl Harbor. Naval facilities, communication stations, and strategic infrastructure across allied nations. Each target is meticulously described with coordinates, estimated population casualties, and strategic justification. It's not a plan for immediate action. It's a contingency scenario, a deterrent strategy. But the existence of such detailed targeting intelligence in active Soviet military communications means these aren't theoretical possibilities. These are prepared options. Bradford reads in complete silence, the blood draining from his face. His hands tremble slightly as he turns each page. The room holds its collective breath. When he finally looks up at Maggie, all the condescension, all the skepticism, all the institutional arrogance has been burned away by the stark reality of what she's uncovered. Dr. Chen, he says, and his voice is hoarse. How confident are you in this translation? 98%, Colonel. The linguistic patterns are consistent, the technical terminology matches known Soviet military doctrine, and the encryption architecture I described has held true across the entire document. This is genuine GRU communication. Bradford looks at his command staff, and something unprecedented happens. This career military officer, this man who has spent 18 months treating the Australian team as junior partners, slowly removes his colonel's insignia from his collar and sets it on the table in front of Maggie. It's a symbolic gesture, antiquated and deeply military, acknowledging a debt that rank cannot repay. Dr. Chen, I owe you an apology. I owe your entire team an apology. And more than that, I owe you and Australia a debt that I'm not sure the United States can ever properly repay. His voice cracks slightly. You've just potentially saved millions of lives. My daughter lives in Sydney. My brother is stationed at Pearl Harbor. The targets on this list, they're not abstractions to me. They're real people. And you've given us the intelligence to prepare, to deter, to prevent this scenario from ever becoming reality. But Maggie isn't finished. She's been awake for nearly 50 hours, running on adrenaline and instant coffee, but there's something else she needs to show him. Colonel, there's more. In the final pages of The Intercept, there's a section we haven't fully translated yet. It references something called Coral Hammer, what appears to be a timeline for activating these contingencies. And based on the transmission date codes, she hands him another printout, this one covered in her handwritten annotations. I believe this plan was scheduled for review by Soviet Pacific Command within the next 6 weeks. The implications are staggering. This isn't just historical intelligence about theoretical targets. This is active, current strategic planning by Soviet forces, intelligence that provides an unprecedented window into enemy capabilities and intentions. Bradford immediately orders the facility to full alert status. Secure communications are sent to Canberra, to Washington, to SINGSPAC headquarters in Hawaii. Within hours, the corridors of Pine Gap are flooded with high-ranking officials, Australian intelligence directors, American NSA liaisons, military brass from both nations. The story spreads quickly through official channels. An Australian cryptographer has cracked a Soviet code that America's best couldn't touch. But the most extraordinary moment comes 3 days later, when a special delegation arrives at Pine Gap via military transport. Among them is Admiral Richard Holbrooke, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Pacific Forces, a man whose authority extends across the entire Pacific theater. He's traveled specifically to meet the team that provided intelligence described in classified briefings as paradigm shifting. The formal ceremony happens in Pine Gap's main briefing room, now crowded with personnel. Admiral Holbrooke, a man known for his gruff demeanor and no-nonsense approach, stands before Maggie and her team. But before the official commendations, he does something unexpected. He asks everyone else to leave the room. Just for a moment, he says, for a private word. When the room clears, leaving only Maggie, her team, Bradford, and the Admiral, Holbrooke's formal bearing cracks. Dr. Chen, he begins, his voice rough with emotion, I need you to understand something. 6 months ago, I sat in a planning meeting where we discussed Pacific defensive scenarios. We talked about nuclear deterrence, about acceptable losses, about which cities and bases we could afford to lose in a first strike scenario. We talked about millions of human beings as statistics, as strategic calculations. He pauses, struggling with the weight of what he's saying. The targets on your list. We've had intelligence suggesting Soviet interest in Pacific positioning, but nothing this specific, nothing this actionable. We were flying blind, making defensive preparations based on educated guesses. You've given us sight. You've given us the ability to protect those lives we were discussing as acceptable casualties. He reaches into his jacket and pulls out a small black box. Inside is a medal. Not military but a civilian intelligence commendation created specifically for this moment, authorized at the highest levels of both Australian and American government. This is inadequate, Holbrook says, fastening it to Maggie's blouse. It doesn't capture what you've done, but it's our attempt to acknowledge that you've changed the course of history. But then something even more remarkable happens. Bradford steps forward, and there are tears in his eyes. This career military officer who has spent his life projecting strength and certainty. Dr. Chen, before everyone comes back in, I need to say something. I've been in intelligence for 23 years. I've worked with the best minds in American cryptography. And I've spent most of my posting here believing that Australian intelligence was second tier. That the real work happened in American facilities by American personnel. I was wrong. Not just wrong. I was blind, arrogant, and prejudiced. I looked at you and saw someone easy to dismiss. Someone whose brilliance I couldn't recognize because it didn't fit my narrow definition of what genius looks like. He's trembling now. The weight of his own biases finally crushing him. I could have stopped you. I almost did. I gave you 48 hours expecting you to fail, hoping to prove that American superiority was justified. And if I had followed my instincts, if I had shut down your investigation when every part of me wanted to, those 50 targets would still be secret. Soviet Pacific Command would have continued developing Coral Hammer unopposed, and when the next crisis hit, because in this world there's always another crisis, millions of people in the cities on that list would have been undefended, unprepared, and possibly dead. His voice breaks completely. My God, I almost caused a catastrophe because I couldn't see past my own arrogance. Maggie Chen, this quiet woman who has spent a lifetime being underestimated, looks at this powerful man's breakdown with profound compassion. She reaches out and gently touches his arm. Colonel Bradford, you're human. We all carry prejudices, blind spots, assumptions that limit what we can see. The important thing is that you're seeing it now, that you're willing to acknowledge it, and that you're choosing to change. Bradford shakes his head. But how do you, after how I treated you, after the dismissiveness and the condescension, how do you not hate me? How can you show me this grace? And here, Maggie reveals something that reframes everything. Colonel, my grandmother, the Russian teacher who raised me, she fled Stalin's purges in 1937. She lost everything, her home, her career, her entire family. She arrived in Darwin with nothing but the clothes on her back and a head full of Russian literature. She faced racism, poverty, and countless people who looked at her and saw only a foreigner, a potential threat. She could have become bitter. She could have taught me to hate the world that had treated her so cruelly. Maggie's voice grows stronger, carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. Instead, she taught me that the greatest strength isn't in being right or being recognized. It's in persisting with quiet dignity when the world dismisses you, in seeing the humanity in those who can't yet see yours, and in using whatever gifts you have to serve something larger than your own ego. She used to say, Maggie, when they underestimate you, don't correct them with anger. Correct them with excellence. And when your excellence finally forces them to see you, respond not with triumph, but with an invitation to do better together.